Dante Valerio was the undisputed shadow over this city, a man whose reputation was built on cold steel and a heart rumored to be carved from obsidian. I was merely a server at Prego, a ghost moving between tables of men who traded in blood and billions while I traded in appetizers and silence. I believed I could mask the rot underneath. I believed I could hide the jagged, violet marks Luciano Rizzo had left on my skin like a brand of ownership. I was wrong. When the lights of the chandelier turned into blinding streaks of white and the floor vanished beneath me, I didn't meet the hard marble. I was caught by a grip that felt like a mountain, steady and unyielding. I didn't expect the apex predator of the underworld to be the one to break my fall. And I never could have imagined that he would tilt my head back, find the bloody fingerprints of his greatest rival pressed into the soft tissue of my neck, and growl the 3 words that signaled the end of Luciano's world. Who touched you? The vanity mirror in the staff restroom was smudged with grease and steam, splitting Elena Moretti's reflection into 1,000 jagged pieces. One version of her was the girl from the old neighborhood, the one who dreamed of law school and quiet Sundays. The other was the hollow-eyed woman staring back now, hands shaking as she adjusted her high-pitched black dress to hide the blossoming trauma on her throat. Elena bit her tongue until she tasted copper, a sharp intake of breath rattling in her chest. Every movement felt like a hot blade sliding between her vertebrae. Just survived tonight, she whispered to the empty room, her internal voice a mere flicker of the fire she used to carry. Just one double shift. The tips from the elite would buy her father another week of safety. They would keep Luciano's enforcers away from her door. She reached up, her fingers trembling as she smoothed the collar of her uniform. It had to be perfect. If the fabric shifted even an inch, the truth would bleed out. She checked the line of her jaw, seeing the faint, yellowish edges of a week-old bruise peeking out from beneath the heavy concealer. Luciano Rizzo, the name used to represent a chance at survival, a way to pay off her father's gambling sins. Now, it was a death sentence she served every single day. Luciano wasn't just a man, he was a monster who fed on the smallness of others, and for the last 6 months, Elena had been the smallest thing in his orbit. Elena, you're on the north balcony. Table 4, Gary, the floor manager, barked as he kicked open the restroom door. Elena flinched, her hand flying to her side. Table 4 was the dead zone, the place where the family sat to discuss the kind of business that made people disappear. Gary, please, she pleaded, her voice a thin thread. My head is spinning. Can I just run the coat check tonight? Gary leaned in, the scent of stale coffee and malice rolling off him. You look like a corpse, Moretti. But Table 4 doesn't care about your health. They care about their vintage cognac. Get out there and smile, or I'll call Luciano myself and tell him you're being difficult. She had no choice. She was trapped between 2 devils, and the only way out was to walk straight into the mouth of the beast. Luciano had doubled the interest on her father's debt this morning, and if she didn't bring home the cash tonight, her father wouldn't live to see the sunrise. Hey family, before this story begins, I want you to do something real quick. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your comments fuel these stories. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button because what happens next will leave you speechless. The heavy scent of iron and cheap cologne always brought Elena back to that rain-slicked Tuesday night 6 months ago. It was the night the world narrowed down to the size of a betting slip. Her father, a man whose hands only shook when he wasn't holding a deck of cards, had sat at the kitchen table with his head in his palms. He hadn't just lost the house or the savings, he had lost a ghost amount, a debt to Luciano Rizzo that couldn't be repaid in currency. Luciano didn't want the money, he wanted the leverage. When the men in the gray suits arrived, they didn't break furniture. They simply stood in the doorway, casting long, predatory shadows over the linoleum floor. Luciano had walked in last, his presence turning the air cold and stagnant. He had looked at Elena, not as a person, but as a high-value asset, a way to bridge the gap between his ledgers. "Your father owes a debt of blood, Elena," he had whispered, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a terrifying familiarity. "But I'm a man of mercy. You come with me, you work for me, and your father keeps his life." The work had started with serving drinks at his private clubs, but it quickly spiraled into a life of psychological and physical cages. Luciano delighted in the silence he could force upon her. Every time she tried to speak up, every time she moved too slowly, his hands would find her neck or her ribs, reminding her that her breath wasn't her own, it was on loan from him. He treated her like a trophy he enjoyed breaking, a porcelain doll he could shatter whenever the mood struck him. She remembered the first time he had grabbed her neck in the back of his darkened town car. The pressure had been precise, cutting off her air just enough to make her vision swim. "You belong to the Rizzo name now," he'd hissed into her ear. "If you run, if you tell, I'll send your father back to the gutter in pieces." Since that night, Elena had lived in a state of permanent winter. She wore the high collars and the long sleeves like a suit of armor, hiding the fingerprints that Luciano left behind as if he were marking his territory. She had become a ghost in her own life, a silent server of drinks and secrets, moving through the upscale halls of Prago while carrying a weight that felt like lead in her veins. She was a woman paying a debt of blood with every heartbeat, never realizing that the predator catching her fall tonight would be the one to finally break those chains. The silence that followed Elena's collapse was heavier than the music and the clinking of crystal. Dante Valerio did not move with the frantic energy of a man in a panic, he moved with the surgical precision of a predator claiming what was his. His iron grip held her steady against his chest, her head lolling back to expose the jagged, bloody fingerprints that Luciano Rizzo had left behind. Gary, the manager, rushed forward, his face a mask of faux concern and terror. "Mr. Valerio, please, let the staff handle this," he stammered, his hands reaching out to pull Elena away. "We can take her to the back, she's just..." Dante's eyes shifted, a flash of lethal gray that stopped the manager mid-sentence. "If you put a single finger on her, you won't have a hand left to pull a paycheck with." Dante's voice was a low, vibrating growl that carried to every corner of the frozen ballroom. The air in the restaurant seemed to thin as the elite guests, men who controlled cities and women who moved markets, watched in stunned disbelief. The king of the underworld, a man who viewed humans as pawns or obstacles, was shielding a common server with a ferocity that bordered on the divine. Gary recoiled as if he had been slapped, his hands dropping to his sides. Dante ignored him, his focus narrowing entirely to the woman in his arms. He could feel the shallow, ragged heat of her breath against his shirt and the way her pulse fluttered like a dying bird against his palm. With a single, fluid motion, he adjusted his hold, tucking her securely against his heart. He didn't wait for an ambulance, and he didn't ask for permission. He strode toward the exit, his polished shoes clicking against the marble in a steady, ominous rhythm. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, the guests lowering their gazes, unable to meet the sheer, unadulterated rage radiating from him. He passed the VIP tables where Luciano's associates sat, his gaze lingering just long enough to send a message: the rules had changed. As he stepped out into the cool night air, the flashing lights of the city reflecting in his eyes, he looked down at the marks on her neck one last time. Luciano had thought he was marking a servant. He didn't realize he had just handed Dante the reason he needed to burn the Rizzo Empire to ash. He reached his armored SUV, his security team already holding the door open in a silent, disciplined blur of motion. He climbed inside, never letting go of her, the darkness of the interior swallowing them both as the city roared to life around them. The transition from the void of unconsciousness to reality was a slow, disorienting climb. Elena felt the softness first, a weightless, silken warmth that was a cruel contrast to the thin, damp mattress she had occupied for months. Her eyelids felt like lead, and as she forced them open, she found herself staring at a ceiling of hand-carved oak illuminated by the soft, golden glow of a fireplace. The room was vast, smelling of sandalwood and rain, a sanctuary that felt more like a dream than a physical space. She tried to sit up, but a sharp, hot lance of pain shot through her neck and chest, forcing a choked gasp from her lips. Memory flooded back in a jagged rush, the spinning lights of the restaurant, the suffocating grip of Luciano's mark on her throat, and the iron-strong arms that had caught her when the world went black. Panic, sharp and familiar, flared in her chest. She began to reach for the collar of her dress, desperate to hide her shame, only to realize she was no longer wearing the stained server's uniform. She had been dressed in a soft, oversized cashmere sweater, and her neck had been carefully bandaged. The sound of a heavy door clicking shut made her freeze. In the shadows near the hearth stood Dante Valerio. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and etched with intricate, dark ink. He looked less like the businessman from the gala and more like the apex predator the city whispered about in terrified tones. "You're in the Valerio estate, Elena," he said, his voice a low, resonant vibration that seemed to settle in her very bones. His eyes, silver and unreadable, watched her from across the room. "Luciano Rizzo cannot reach you here. He cannot even see the walls of this house without my permission." Elena swallowed, the movement pulling at her bruised skin. She knew this name. She knew that Luciano, the man who had made her feel like a broken toy, spoke of Dante Valerio with a reverence born of pure, unadulterated fear. She was in the den of the only man her monster was afraid of. The realization brought a strange, dizzying mixture of terror and relief. She was still a prisoner of the underworld, but the bars were now made of gold, and the man holding the key was the only one who had looked at her bruises not with the desire to add more, but with the cold, lethal intent to avenge them. She watched him move closer, his presence expanding to fill every inch of the room, and for the first time in 6 months, Elena felt the crushing weight of Luciano's debt begin to crack. The air in the Valerio war room was thick with the scent of ozone and expensive tobacco, but beneath it lay the cold, metallic tang of impending violence. Dante stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the glittering city lights. He didn't look like a man who had just saved a life, he looked like a man who was preparing to end 1,000. In front of him, on a mahogany desk that had seen the signing of treaties and death warrants alike, sat a small, velvet-lined box. It looked like something that might hold a piece of fine jewelry, but the contents were far more precious to Dante. It was a receipt for the first installment of a debt Luciano Rizzo could never hope to pay. Dante reached out, his tattooed fingers steady as he adjusted the lid. Inside, resting on white silk, was a severed finger. It belonged to the man who had served as the middleman, the one who had facilitated the sale of Elena's father's debt to Luciano, knowing exactly what kind of hell he was consigning her to. There was no note included. There didn't need to be. The absence of a ring and the precision of the cut told the story perfectly. Dante knew everything, and he was coming for the rest. "Deliver this to Luciano's dinner table," Dante said, his voice as sharp as the blade that had taken the trophy. "Make sure he sees it before he takes his first bite. I want him to taste the fear before he tastes the wine." His enforcers moved with the silence of ghosts, vanishing into the corridors of the estate. Dante turned back to the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. He could feel the shift in the city's atmosphere, the way the streets were already beginning to hold their breath. By morning, every underboss and street soldier would know that the ceasefire between the Valerio and Rizzo families had been incinerated. He thought of Elena, sleeping fitfully upstairs under the watchful eyes of his personal physicians. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those bloody fingerprints on her neck, the carotid artery pulsing beneath the trauma where Luciano's hands had squeezed the life out of her. That mark was a declaration, and this box was his reply. Luciano had spent 6 months making Elena feel small, but Dante was about to show him that the smallest spark could burn down an entire empire. The war hadn't just begun, it had already been won in Dante's mind. Now, he was just waiting for the world to catch up to the carnage. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows across the room, but the space between them felt suspended in time. Dante moved with a stillness that contradicted the violence of his reputation. He set a small silver basin and fresh medical supplies on the nightstand, the clink of glass against wood the only sound in the vast chamber. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, her hands gripping the silk sheets, her body coiled tight in anticipation of pain. Muscle memory told her that a man's hand near her neck meant she was about to lose her breath. "Turn your head," Dante said. His voice was devoid of the command she was used to, it was a quiet request. Elena flinched as he stepped into her personal space, her shoulder jerking up defensively. Dante stopped instantly. He didn't pull back, but he didn't advance. He simply waited, his gray eyes locking onto hers, demanding she acknowledge the difference between the past and the present. "I am not him," Dante said, the words low and absolute. "You are safe in this room. You are safe with me." Slowly, Elena lowered her shoulder, exposing the throat that had been weaponized against her for so long. Dante reached out, and she squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the grip. Instead, she felt the cool, rough texture of his calloused fingertips brushing her jawline. He was unweaving the old bandages with a patience that seemed impossible for a man who had just declared war on the city. When the gauze fell away, revealing the angry, violet bruising where Luciano's fingers had dug in, Dante's jaw tightened. A flash of that earlier rage darkened his eyes, but his hands remained steady. He dipped a cloth into the basin and pressed it to her skin. The coolness was a shock, followed immediately by the warmth of his other hand steadying the back of her head. He applied a thick, soothing ointment, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her pulse. It was the most vulnerable part of her anatomy, the place where life was most easily extinguished, and yet he touched her as if she were made of something sacred. "He tried to leave his mark on you," Dante murmured, his gaze fixed on the injury as he secured the fresh bandage. "But bruises fade, Elena. And when they do, nothing of him will remain." Elena felt a tear slip down her cheek, hot and fast. It wasn't born of pain, but of the overwhelming, foreign sensation of being tended to rather than taken from. Dante caught the tear with his thumb before it could fall. He didn't offer empty comforts or look away from her grief. He simply held her gaze, his hand lingering against her face, bridging the chasm between his world of violence and her need for peace. For the first time, she didn't see the king of the underworld, she saw the man beneath the myth, and he was the only one who had ever offered her a shield instead of a sword. The tenderness of the moment shattered with the sound of breaking glass downstairs. It wasn't the accidental clumsy drop of a vase, it was the distinct, violent crash of a breached perimeter window. Dante didn't freeze. The transition from gentle healer to lethal protector was instantaneous, a terrifying flip of a switch that turned his eyes from soft gray to cold steel. He extinguished the lamp with a swipe of his hand, plunging the room into darkness, and pulled a heavy pistol from the drawer of the nightstand before the echo of the crash had even faded. "Stay here," Dante commanded, his voice low and absolute. He pressed Elena into the narrow, shadowed space between the heavy oak wardrobe and the wall. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear. Elena nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She curled into a ball, pressing her hands over her ears as the heavy thud of boots resonated on the marble stairs. Luciano hadn't waited for the morning. He had sent a retrieval team, a desperate, arrogant move to reclaim what he believed he owned. Dante moved to the doorway, blending into the shadows like a wraith. The hallway was dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through the skylights. 3 figures moved in tactical formation, their weapons equipped with suppressors that looked like long, black fingers. They weren't common street thugs, these were hitmen paid to extract a target. Valerio, one of the men hissed into the dark. Give us the girl. Rizzo just wants his property back. No need to bleed for a waitress. The word property acted like a catalyst for the violence coiling inside Dante. He stepped out from the alcove, his movement too fast to track. 2 shots rang out, controlled, precise cracks of thunder in the confined space. The lead hitman dropped instantly. The second man swung his rifle, spraying bullets that chewed into the plaster of the walls, but Dante was already moving, closing the distance. He caught the gunman's barrel with one hand and drove the butt of his pistol into the man's temple with a sickening crunch. The third man hesitated, seeing his team dismantled in seconds. That hesitation was his death sentence. Dante didn't offer mercy, he offered a single shot to the chest that sent the intruder crashing over the banister to the floor below. Silence rushed back into the hallway, heavier than before, smelling of cordite and copper. Dante didn't holster his weapon. He walked to the edge of the railing, ensuring the threat was neutralized, before turning back to the bedroom. He found Elena trembling in the corner, her eyes wide with the realization of what had just happened. He was covered in the dust of the fight, a smear of someone else's blood on his white shirt, yet when he looked at her, the monster receded just enough to let the protector through. Luciano had sent wolves to the door, but he had forgotten that a dragon lived inside. The adrenaline from the hallway gunfight hadn't faded, it had crystallized into a cold, hard purpose. Dante didn't hide Elena away this time. He brought her into the nerve center of his operation, a room lined with monitors and maps that glowed with the pulse of the city. He placed a heavy stack of dossiers on the table, Luciano's known fronts, his shipping routes, his banks. He thinks you were just a waitress, Dante said, his voice grim. He thinks you were furniture. Tell me I'm right. Elena looked down at the maps. For 6 months, she had been invisible, a ghost hovering at the edge of Luciano's private meetings, refilling glasses while he boasted about shipments and shell companies. He had spoken freely in front of her because he never believed a servant had the capacity to understand the machinery of his empire. That arrogance was about to be his tomb. He doesn't use the eastern docks on Tuesdays, Elena said, her voice trembling slightly before finding a new, steel-like cadence. He uses the marina in Jersey. The shipment coming in tonight isn't electronics, it's raw heroin hidden in industrial textiles. And the money, he doesn't keep it in the Caymans anymore. It's moved through a tech startup in Midtown called Vertex. Dante didn't question her. He didn't hesitate. He picked up the secure line, his gray eyes locked on hers as he relayed the coordinates. Burn the textiles at the marina. Seize the servers at Vertex. Drain every account associated with the routing number she's about to give you. The next 4 hours were a symphony of systematic destruction. Elena stood by Dante's side, feeding him codes and dates she had memorized out of sheer terror, now repurposing them as ammunition. On the screens, she watched as Luciano's world turned red. Live feeds showed warehouses engulfed in flames, the night sky over the harbor choked with black smoke. Alerts flashed as bank accounts were frozen, millions of dollars vaporizing into the digital ether. Luciano Rizzo wasn't just losing money, he was losing his credibility, his supply, and his power, all in the span of a single night. The phone on the desk buzzed, a text from an associate confirming the final blow. Dante looked at the screen, then at Elena. She wasn't trembling anymore. She was looking at the burning harbor on the monitor with a grim satisfaction. "You didn't just survive him, Elena," Dante murmured, moving to stand behind her, his presence a warm, solid wall against her back. "You just killed him. All that's left now is the body." The realization settled over her. She hadn't just been saved, she had become the weapon. Luciano had spent years sharpening her against the stone of his cruelty, never realizing that one day, she would be the blade held against his throat. The VIP room at Prego, once the throne room where Luciano Rizzo held court, was now just a cage. The tables were overturned, the fine crystal shattered, remnants of the desperate last stand his remaining guards had tried to make before Dante's men swept through them like a tide of black water. Luciano sat alone at the center table, a bottle of expensive scotch clutching his hand like a lifeline. He looked smaller than Elena remembered. Stripped of his army, his money, and his fear factor, he was just a sweating, desperate man in a ruined suit. Dante kicked the double doors open, the sound echoing like a gunshot. He walked in with Elena a step ahead of him, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, not to push her forward, but to let her know he was the wall behind her. Luciano looked up, his eyes bloodshot and full of a venomous, impotent rage. "You bring a waitress to kill a boss?" Luciano spat, his voice cracking. "That's an insult, Valerio. Even for you." "She's not a waitress," Dante said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "And you're not a boss. You're a bad investment." Dante didn't waste time with speeches. He crossed the room, grabbed Luciano by the lapels, and threw him to the floor. The king scrambled back, hitting the leg of a table, looking up at Elena with a flicker of his old malice. "You think you're free?" Luciano hissed at her. "You're property. You'll always be property. Your father sold you, and you bought it." Elena stared down at him. For years, this man's voice had been the sound of her nightmares. Now, it just sounded like noise. She felt Dante move beside her. He drew his sidearm, a heavy, matte black pistol, and held it out to her, handle first. "The debt is cleared, Elena," Dante said softly, ignoring Luciano entirely. "But the nightmare doesn't end until you wake up. You have the power to decide when morning comes." Elena took the weapon. It was heavier than she expected, cold and dense with potential. She wrapped her fingers around the grip, the metal warming against her skin. She looked at Luciano, really looked at him, and saw the terror finally taking root in his eyes. He wasn't looking at a servant anymore, he was looking at his executioner. "Elena, wait," Luciano stammered, raising a hand. "We can make a deal. I have money hidden." "I burned your money," she said, her voice steady, surprising herself with its lack of tremor. "And I don't want a deal. I want silence." She raised the gun. Her hand didn't shake. The phantom weight of his fingers on her neck, the years of looking at the floor, the shame of her father's sins, it all focused into a single point of pressure on the trigger. She wasn't asking for permission. She wasn't paying a debt. She was closing the account. The gunshot was deafening, a final, thunderous period at the end of a long, painful sentence. Luciano fell back, silence finally reclaiming the room. Elena lowered the gun, her ears ringing, and felt Dante's hand cover hers, gentle and grounding. The monster was dead. She was finally awake. 3 weeks later, the air outside Prego was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn rain, but Elena didn't feel the chill. She stepped out of the armored black SUV, her hand resting lightly in Dante's. She wasn't wearing the stifling, high-collared uniform that had been her armor for so long. Instead, she wore a backless gown of midnight silk that draped over her body like water, leaving her neck exposed. Around her throat, where purple bruises had once bloomed like violent flowers, rested a necklace of diamonds cold enough to freeze a man's heart. They didn't walk toward the service entrance in the alley. They walked straight to the double glass doors at the front. Gary, the floor manager who had once barked at her to hide her pain for the sake of the clientele, was standing at the podium. As he saw them approach, the color drained from his face. He didn't sneer. He didn't check his watch or complain about the table arrangement. He scrambled to open the door, bowing so low that he nearly headbutted the host stand. "Mr. Valerio," Gary stammered, his voice trembling. "Ms. Moretti. Welcome back." Elena paused at the threshold. She looked at Gary, really looked at him, and realized how small he was. He wasn't a monster, he was just a man who worshipped power, and the deity had changed. She didn't say a word. She simply offered him a faint, cool smile, the kind a queen offers a peasant, and walked past him. The restaurant fell silent, just as it had the night she collapsed. But this silence wasn't born of shock or pity, it was born of reverence. As she walked through the dining room on Dante's arm, she felt the eyes of the city's elite on her. They weren't looking through her anymore. They were looking at her. Waiters she had worked alongside for months stopped in their tracks, pressing themselves against the walls to clear her path, their heads dipped in respect. Dante led her not to a secluded corner, but to table 1, the center of the room, the seat of power. He pulled out her chair, his hand lingering on her bare shoulder, a possessive, grounding touch that told the room exactly who she was. "Different view from this side of the table," Dante murmured as he took his seat across from her. Elena looked around. She saw the kitchen doors swinging open, the blur of motion where she used to run herself into the ground. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window. The cracked, terrified girl from the staff bathroom was gone. In her place sat a woman who had walked through fire and come out carrying the flame. "Yes," Elena replied, picking up the crystal flute of champagne that a trembling server had just poured. She met Dante's gaze, her eyes clear and unshadowed. "It's a beautiful view." She took a sip, the bubbles sharp and sweet against her tongue. She had fallen in this room, broken and invisible. She had risen in this room, whole and feared. The debt was paid. The bruises were gone. And for the first time in her life, Elena Moretti didn't just have a seat at the table, she owned it. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share it with those you love so they too can hear this meaningful tale. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the emotional stories we bring you every day. We sincerely thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. Wishing you and your loved ones abundant health, joyful lives, and hearts always full of love. Goodbye.